Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ102, Introduction to Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So this week's lecture is going to be on Chapter 2, where we're going to take a look at the nature and extent of crime. So let's go ahead and just jump right into our lecture for this week. So a couple of the learning objectives, we're going to discuss how crime is defined. We're going to define and discuss some of the different types of crime and explain the methods used to measure crime. What are some of those reports, documents, databases, etc., that are used in order to track crime and measure it? Is it up or down, etc.? We'll discuss the strengths and weaknesses of these different measurements. We'll take a look at the crime trends, the crime rate, summarize some various crime patterns, and then finally we'll finish up by kind of taking a close look at the problem of chronic offending. So let's start off with this particular picture that you look to the right there, and you can see it says the fear of crime. Well, first of all, I should ask you, is there such a thing as the fear of crime? Are Americans justified in their fear of crime? Should we barricade ourselves behind bars and bunkers and things like that, or armed guards, etc.? I mean, right now, many of us have cameras and bars on the windows and alarm systems and all that kind of stuff. But are crime rates rising, or are they falling? And that's always an interesting question, because sometimes it's a matter of perspective. But there are mechanisms in place that kind of tell us if things are, up or down, etc. So with that said, the justice system focuses on crime and its control. And while for the most part, or for most of us, this concept of crime seems pretty simple, right? A violation of law. But the question remains, why are some acts considered a violation of law when others, seemingly more serious, at least in your mind, my mind, etc., are non-criminal? So that's always an interesting thing. Why are some crimes crimes and others not? And should this be one and should that not, etc.? So a lot of thought kind of, should be bouncing around in your head right now with that. Well, there are actually three views of how and why some behaviors become illegal and, are considered crimes, excuse me, while others remain non-criminal. So the first one is the consensus view. And this is the view that certain behaviors must be outlawed or controlled, and that criminal law is designed to protect citizens from social harm. So according to the consensus view of crime, behaviors that become crimes are those that, number one, are essentially harmful to most citizens, and number two, have been controlled or prohibited by existing criminal law. So a set of rules, which would be criminal law, codified or codified, depending upon how you like to say it, meaning written by state authorities, that express, the norms, goals, and values of the vast majority of society. So that would be kind of like, under the consensus view, criminal law then is or are those sets of rules. So the consensus view, basically, to kind of sum it up, rests on the assumption that criminal law has a social control function, something that we've heard of already, restraining those whose behavior would otherwise endanger the social framework by taking advantage of others' weakness for their own personal gain. And criminal law works to control behaviors that are inherently destructive and dangerous in order to maintain the existing social fabric and ensure the peaceful functioning of our society. And then next would be what we call the conflict view of crime. So the conflict view of crime is the view that criminal law is created and enforced by those who hold political and economic power, and is a tool used by the ruling class to control dissatisfied, have-not members of society. Okay, or rich versus poor, if that's kind of an easier way to say it. The conflict view holds that the ongoing class struggle between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, control the content of criminal law and thereby shapes the definition of crime. So kind of an interesting thought process right there, right? So a little bit more. According to this view, criminal law is created and enforced by the ruling class, again, as a mechanism for controlling, the dissatisfied have-nots. The law is an instrument that enables the wealthy to maintain their position of power and control the behavior of those who might oppose their ideas and values, or who might rebel against the unequal distribution of wealth. So laws defining property crimes such as larceny and burglary are created to protect the wealth of the affluent. People who steal from the wealthy are severely punished. The wealthy who manipulate the economic system for their personal gain are considered above the law. So you can see kind of the difference between the consensus view, right, and the conflict view. And next we have what we call the interactionist view. So falling between the consensus and the conflict visions, if you will, the interactionist view of crime suggests that criminal law is structured to reflect the preferences and opinions of people who hold social power in a particular legal jurisdiction and use their influence to shape that legal process. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. So again, the view that criminal law reflects the preference and opinions of the people who have that or hold that social power in society and use their influence to improve their own values and moral code on the rest of the population. And again, this falls between the consensus and the conflict vision, because the interactionist view of crime suggests that criminal law is structured to reflect the preferences and opinions of those people who hold that social power and use their influence to actually shape the legal process. So here's kind of a little chart that shows the differences, and these charts are actually great because you can kind of look at them and you can really pick out the differences between the three of those. So with that said, let's kind of look at how crime is defined. Well, real quick before I jump, let me kind of finish up just on those three different views. Remember, we talked about consensus, conflict, and interaction. I just kind of thought of something right now. Keep in mind that although those three views of crime differ, they do generally agree that criminal law defines crime. The definition of crime is consistently changing and evolving, and that social forces mold the definition of crimes. And then finally, criminal law has a social control function. So with that being said, the term crime, let's kind of define it, right? So again, through consensus, conflict, and interactionist views of crime, although they differ, they do agree that criminal law defines crime. The definition of crime is changing. Social forces mold the definition of crime. and criminal law does have a social control function. Therefore, crime is a violation of social rules of conduct interpreted and expressed by a written criminal code created by people holding social and political power. Its content may be influenced by prevailing public sentiments, historically developed moral beliefs, and the need to protect public safety. So persons who violate these rules may be subject to sanctions administered by the state authority, which include social stigma and loss of status, freedom, and on occasion, their lives. So kind of an interesting thought, right, on how crime can actually be changed, manipulated, etc. So what then are some categories of crimes? And we're not going to go through all of these because there are just so many. Millions of criminal acts occur each year, and their diversity and variety is staggering. And crimes range in seriousness from shoplifting to, serial murder. And some crimes are violent and destructive, and others target property, yet others are motivated by economic gain. And then some are just public order crimes, right? You could be talking about things like, drug use or prostitution that threaten or violate what we call the moral standard. That's what public order crimes kind of fall into that little category. So we know that there's so many. Americans really are bombarded with television news stories and newspaper articles featuring, grisly accounts of violent gangs, serial murder, child abuse, and rape. So there are just so many things, when you kind of think about it. And although rates of violent crime, for the most part, except in some big cities over the last year or so, but for the most part, have declined significantly over the past decade, most Americans still worry about becoming a victim of crime. And I think that's really true. And some criminal acts are defined as expressive, and some are defined as instrumental. So expressive crime is where violent behavior is motivated by rage, anger, or frustration. And instrumental crime is where violent behavior results from criminal activity designed to improve the financial status of the robber or the suspect, the culprit, like shooting someone during a bank robbery. Okay, so you can see that when you talk about violent crime, there's just a little bit of difference right there. And I'll show you some charts in just a little bit. We also have gang violence. Gang killings have become so common that, gang-related killings have been recognized as a separate, unique category called gang homicide. Today, there's an estimated 30,000 gangs with about 850,000 members that can be found in about 3,300 jurisdictions across the United States. And the number of gangs has increased about 15% in the past decade, as has the number of gang members. And here's a picture of the National Gang Report. This is all, if you're interested in gang statistical data, this is a really good report to look at. And I wanted to kind of show you this just because it's very intriguing. If you were to take a criminology class, I'd probably show you this. But here are two high schools in the city of Compton. One is Compton High School and the other is Centennial High School. And this can show you kind of how the gangs actually work, even though we're not going to get into too much more detail. As you can see, Centennial, which is located on the north side of the city of Compton, is all red on the outside and on the inside of the gym. Okay. Compton High School, which is in the center of the city basically, is all blue. Now, that could be a coincidence, or it's not. And really, it's not. It's because Centennial If you're not a blood gang member, you're not going to go to Centennial High School. Blood wears the color red. And if you're not a Crip gang member, you're not going to go to Compton High School. Blue is affiliated with Crip. Okay? And just to show you some different, types of gangs. Again, we're not going to go into it, but you have your blood gangs, your pyro gangs, your Crip gangs. You have biker gangs. You have Asian street gangs. I mean, there's so many different types, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. But I just wanted you to know that, this gang violence has really been an issue, and it continues to rise in many, many communities. Okay, so the United States, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit about, we're still on categories of crime, but we're going to talk about homicides. So the United States is not immune to such horror, meaning like, multiple murders, etc. On December 2nd, 2015, U.S.-born Rizwan Farouk and Pakistani nationalist Tashfeen Malik killed 14 people and wounded 21 more at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino. Pretty close to home, right? A lot of times we think about these killings, these shootings, these multiple murder shootings, and we kind of think of, well, that doesn't happen here. Well, San Bernardino County is pretty close to a lot of us, right? On November 29th, 2015, a gunman entered the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado, killing 3 people and injuring 9 more. On September 16th, 2013, Aaron Alexis, a Navy contractor, killed 12 people at the Washington Navy Yard. On July 20th, 2012, James Holmes entered a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and shot into the audience with multiple firearms, killing 12 people and injuring 58. The list goes on. These tragedies highlight the threat of mass killings by seemingly deranged gunmen or women. And then most recently would be the multiple shooting that took place in Las Vegas. So to kind of give you a little bit more information, we're going to talk about or define 3 different types of what we call multiple killers. The first would be a mass murderer. And this is the type of multiple killer who kills many victims in a single violent outburst. Right? So like just one, it all happens at the same time. Okay? Spree killers. Type of multiple killer who spreads the murderous outbursts over a few days or weeks. So it kind of goes on a little bit. It could be, a day, 2 days later, a day later, or, every day for a week, etc. And then you have the last one, which is a serial killer, a type of multiple killer who kills over a long period of time, but typically assumes a normal identity between murders. So like the Golden State Killer, who killed for quite a, several years and then disappeared for, 20, 30 years and then recently got arrested. So different types, right? So they're really, mass murderers, just to kind of give you a little bit more information, such as the Columbine High School shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. Serial killers such as Jeffrey Dahmer of Milwaukee, and spree killers such as John Allen Muhammad, the DC sniper, if you remember that case, have become very familiar to the American public. And the threat of unknown, random, and deranged assailant attacks has really been kind of part of modern reality. And, it's kind of scary, right? And there's no single explanation for serial, spree, or mass murder. Such widely disparate factors, things like mental illness, sexual frustration, neurological damage, child abuse and neglect, smothering maternal relationships, and childhood anxiety have been suggested as possible causes. However, a lot of experts view multiple murderers as psychopaths who from early childhood demonstrated bizarre behaviors like torturing animals, setting fires, etc. Enjoy killing and basically are impervious to their victims' suffering, and then bask in the media limelight when they get caught. So I mean, just kind of, these are things that are true and happen all the time. Richard Ramirez would be a good example of the last person who kind of basks in the media limelight. And then another type of crime would be what they call intimate violence. Although violent attacks by strangers produce the most fear and create the most graphic headlines, we really do face greater physical danger from people whom, we are kind of close or intimate with, or we have met before. Spouse, other relatives, dating partners, etc. And, even child abuse, when you look at the numbers, there were 702,000, unique child victims in 2014, or, 9.4 per 1,000 population. So, some of them were repeatedly victimized, so the number of distinct victimizations, really could be considerably higher, and probably is. About 3/4 of those cases, children suffered neglect, but in the remaining quarter, children suffered either physical abuse, sexual abuse, or even both. So again, a lot of different types of crimes. Hate crimes, criminal acts directed toward a particular person or members of a group because they share a discernible racial, ethnic, religious, or gender characteristics. Law enforcement agencies submitted incident reports involving 5,479 criminal incidents and 6,418 offenses as being motivated by bias towards race, gender identity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and ethnicity in 2014. Hate crimes can include things like desecration of a church or a cemetery, harassment of a minority group, or racially motivated murder. So there's a lot of different avenues that this can fall into. Here's kind of a more recent. Every year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, publishes yearly statistics, and you're going to learn a little bit more about this in just a minute. Here's the latest hate crime statistics for 2019, and they usually run about a year and a half or so behind. If you want to know more on the crime stats for 2019, you can go to this link. But here we have basically hate crime stats and the different bias motivations, and you can see the different sections, right, compared to what we just talked about. So you can see it looks like the numbers are typically going up. All right. So now that we kind of know some different types of crimes, let's kind of look at the different categories of crimes. And typically, what you'll see is the FBI, again, publishes what they call the Uniform Crime Report yearly or annually, however you want to say it. And I apologize if you can hear my phone ringing in the background. If you can, sorry about that. But they publish in property crime and violent crime. So crime against person and crime against property. And they publish it part 1 and part 2 crimes. And you're going to learn all this, but I want you to know that there's violent crime or crimes against person and property crime or crimes against property, which really doesn't involve violence. So that's typically how it's broken up. So we'll start with property crime. Now, property crimes rarely draw a lot of attention, right, compared to violent crimes. But they are far more common and in many ways more costly. According to the FBI, property crimes outnumber violent crimes by a margin of approximately 7-1. They also cost America billions of dollars each year. All right. And property crimes are typically kind of broken into 2 broad categories: the theft property crimes and damage property crimes. Okay. Sometimes property crimes are just all lumped together, and I'll show you what a chart looks like in just a minute. But for sake of conversation, we have, crimes against person, crimes against property. We're talking about crimes against property. And in that crimes against property, sometimes they separate it out into two categories, theft and damage. And the theft offenses include things like larceny, embezzlement, receiving stolen property. So those are a couple of different things that fall underneath the theft. And then the damage, okay, would be things like arson, vandalism, trespassing. Okay, so you can see the two broad categories. Now, kind of a separate and larger scope crime, property crime, is going to be burglary. Okay, and we're going to talk about burglary and larceny a little bit, because these are the larger crimes that you're going to run into quite often as a law enforcement officer. So burglary, like trespassing, involves, basically what we call property invasion, or you're going onto someone's property. It's different from trespassing, as it requires the intent to commit a crime. Burglary is often equated with robbery, but robbery is a crime of violence, right? And has different elements. So robbery is a crime against a person. Burglary is a crime property. So here's the definition. And you can look at these, and this is how you're going to be able to start to learn a little bit, because every crime has elements. So let's look at burglary. Every person who enters any house, room, apartment, tenement, shop, warehouse, store, mill, barn, and there's a bunch of other things, with the intent. So this section, if you're going to prove burglary, you have to prove the suspect had intent to commit grand or petty theft, or larceny, or any other felony. Robbery, which is a crime against person, is the felonious taking of personal property in the possession of a person, from their person or immediate presence, against their will, by force or fear. Can you see the difference? So if you're going to arrest someone for burglary, you have to establish that they entered one of these places with this intent to commit this crime. If you're going to establish robbery, you have to show that they did the felonious taking of property from somebody else or their immediate presence against their will, by force or fear. So those are some of the differences when you look at those two types of crime. So these specific statutory elements of a crime are spelled out in detail and must be met beyond a reasonable doubt, okay, for a defendant to be found guilty. So again, if you're going to prosecute a case, and you can click on those links and it'll take you to the actual section if you want to look. Larceny, on the other hand, is theft. It's the most common property crime. It makes up about 75% of all serious crimes reported to the police. The law usually distinguishes between what we call petty and grand larceny, or theft. Petty theft is typically less than $1,000. Grand theft is typically $1,000 or more. And larceny also has elements. So if you're going to prove, larceny, it's the taking and carrying away, asportation means carrying away, of another person's personal property. So that's kind of, interesting there, right? Public order crimes that we talked about, societies have long banned or limited behaviors that are considered to be contrary to social norms, customs, or values. And these behaviors are commonly referred to as public order offenses, things like prostitution and pornography. So those would be a couple of different things. Prostitution is a crime that typically involves engaging in sexual acts for money or compensation. Okay, and prostitution is, for a good reason, often referred to as the world's oldest profession, as it was a common practice in ancient Greece and Babylon. Today, fewer than 50,000 prostitution arrests are being made annually, with the gender ratio being about 2 to 1 female to male. So that's a little bit more on prostitution. Um, illegal substance abuse. This is another crime. Even though the United States has been waging a war on drugs for some time, millions of Americans still abuse substances on a very routine basis. Substance abuse is of much concern to the criminal justice policymakers because there is unquestionably a link between substance abuse and crime. You think about that. When you get addicted to a certain substance and it impacts not only your life, maybe your marriage, your relationship with somebody else, it could impact your job. You could lose your job. And if you keep using drugs, at some point, you're going to have to figure out, how do I get the drugs? And then that person ends up resorting to criminal activity. So we know that there is a link between substance abuse and crime. But again, this really is very concerning to criminal justice policymakers. Economic crimes. Millions of property and theft related crimes occur each year. Most of the work of, kind of what we call occasional criminals or amateurs, whose decision to steal is really spontaneous, kind of opportunistic crimes, if you will, and whose acts are unskilled and unplanned. Many thefts, ranging from shoplifting to burglary, are also committed by school-age youth during the summertime. It's kind of it begs to kind of reason that during the summertime, certain crimes tend to go up because kids aren't in school, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have things like white-collar crime or corporate crime. Well, some criminal activities involve people and institutions whose acknowledged purpose is profit through illegal business transactions. Included in the category of white-collar crime, which is what we're talking about, are such acts as tax evasion, credit card fraud, bank fraud. White-collar criminals also use their positions of trust in business or government to commit crimes. And then you have corporate crime, which is, committed by, a corporation or individuals who control the corporation or other business entity for such purpose as illegally increasing market shares, avoiding taxes, thwarting the competition, etc. Price fixing, antitrust violation, false advertising, all of those types of things fall under corporate crime. So you can see there's a lot of different types of crime, right? And we're running right about halfway. We're going to go just a little bit more, and then we'll stop for our first break for this chapter. So we'll talk a little bit quickly about organized crime. And this involves the criminal activity of people and organizations whose acknowledged purpose is economic gain through illegal enterprise. And we usually, when we talk about organized crime, we always, we talk about gangs because gangs are organized. If you look over here, I put kind of a linking chart of the Vagos outlaw motorcycle gang in San Bernardino County. And they have different chapters, but you can see they're very organized, right? And gangs do certain things to support the gang besides, homicides and assaults and things like that. They make methamphetamine, they sell drugs, there's some prostitution, that's how they make money and do different things, and different gangs do different types of crimes. So that, that's just, that's the smaller version of organized crime. If you want to know what a gang is, and again, this isn't a gang class, any ongoing organization, 3 or more members, common name, sign, or symbol, its primary activity is the commission of crimes that are found in these sections of the Penal Code. And then they engage in a pattern of criminal activity. And here you can go click here and it'll take you to that code. And then again, we talked a little bit about gangs in a previous chapter, but you have different gangs, and whether it's motorcycle gangs, prison gangs, street gangs, they all are organized in a sense, and part of their job is to make money, commit crimes, etc. On the organized crime front, those are larger organizations. organizations. Organized crime involves the criminal activity of people and organizations whose acknowledged purpose is economic gain through criminal enterprise. And these are typically those larger cartels. These criminal cartels provide outlawed goods and services demanded by the general public. It could be prostitution, narcotics, gambling, loan sharking, pornography, liquor, cigarettes, etc. In addition, organized criminals infiltrate legitimate businesses and organizations like unions to basically skim money and profits for illegal purposes. So again, that's kind of the difference if you go back between a cartel and a gang. All right, so we're going to stop right here, and this will be our first break, and we'll conclude part 1 of chapter 2. And when we come back, we'll jump into part 2.